Hello, hello, and welcome. Ah, Thank you for joining another session of the Azure Spring Clean 2026. My name is Vanessa Tovis. By trade, I'm a Microsoft 365 solutions architect, and for Druva, I'm what's called a subject matter expert. So basically, I work across all different departments from product and engineering to marketing to sales, and I represent really how organizations have used and are continuing to use Microsoft technologies. Um, Druva is, for those of you that don't know, Druva is a data protection um, first, right, company, and then data resiliency after, right? So there's kind of has been a split in companies that are data protection companies, kind of like one that has really stayed just focused on the concepts of what I back up and what I restore and those functions, but then others that have really changed and shifted their architectures towards overall resilience, right, for customers. So let's get started here, right? In the next, I think 50 minutes or so, we're going to kind of break down um, some of the things you may or may not even know about Microsoft's cloud, um, both the impacts of AI that are occurring, right? Cyber incident response, and then really just help you kind of understand where those differences of classes of backup vendors are, because they play a big part in recovering in an organization's ability to be resilient. And what does that mean, right? The difference. And then we'll talk really about the ecosystem and what's under attack, right? And that it's under attack. So when we think about this cloud ecosystem of Microsoft, that's like Azure and everything underneath this world, Entra ID, Microsoft 365, the Power Platform, and anything that hooks into it. These attackers that are coming after it, they're not going anywhere. In fact, these issues aren't really going anywhere. They're just kind of compounding. These attackers, they are resilient, they are smart, and they are patient. They are now right organized and working together. They have resources behind them. Engineers, and when I talk about engineers, I'm talking about Microsoft's engineers. And Microsoft's engineers in this case, by all means, they don't intend to introduce vulnerabilities, but that's the nature of developing code, right? And staying on top of things. Data loss gaps in the platform. We don't dig into too much about this, but when Microsoft themselves is saying you can't use version history as a mechanism of recovery, and you can't rely on legal hold because legal hold was designed really for more exporting of data, um, right? And these are the things, and there's buttons. There's a use case behind the recycle bin or behind retention policies, and none of which in the world of the production world um, is it intended to solve the cyber resiliency issue, right? And then there are, of course, the wonderful users and even admins. I see something, I see a button because I can, I will, and I do it. And you only have to look at the service, your own ticketing system as to what issues your users are facing, right, about data that they've lost or that they've needed. Now, let's dig in a little bit to an example, right, of a cyber attack. Now, Storm 0501, Microsoft released their first post on this, their blog in 2024, September. It is now a year and a half later, 20, yeah, something like that. And you would be surprised that people still don't even know about this. This is still active. Even though they released it in 2024, it was the prior several months that they began seeing the patterns of it. And the patterns of that, and just this is just one, like I mentioned, where now you're dealing with a hybrid attack. And the hybrid attack is for those companies that are both on-prem and they also have a cloud right? Cloud representation, like the cloud, Microsoft's cloud. How many times can I say cloud in a row, right? Uh, they have Azure, and in this case. And so the attack comes from a compromise of a credential, which we'll talk a little bit more of, or a compromise. And so it's not necessarily on the endpoint. In this case, it doesn't come with some malware that a user clicked. Right? It didn't come from a phishing attack. Someone maybe harvested credentials that way, but now this attack, one, goes back into your physical network, and then it also goes into your cloud resources. And cloud resources are things like your OneDrive, your SharePoint, your email, and then it's also attacking the endpoint, the laptop, desktop, right? So um, the 1 hour and 42 minutes that you're seeing is a number reported by Microsoft as to when a threat actor enters in, when do they begin their traverse into it. So it's like an hour and 42 minutes. But you have to look at someone like CrowdStrike, who just released their 2025 findings. And now I think you can find this article, but they've identified it's under 30 minutes that a full network scan is already completed. Under 30 minutes. Right, so these attackers, whether it's within that first entry point to just do their assessment of what's there, or it's something that takes, 2 months. When I go to speak at these B-side conferences, they're regional conferences, very similar to like Microsoft Community Days, but it's all about security. The number they're talking about, right, the dwell time is usually anywhere from like 120 days to 200 days. It's like varies. It's not like 2 weeks. So there's a lot that can happen within this window of time and this traversing. So when we use this as the example, here's what they are doing. Here's what the Storm 0501 is doing. They are looking for data. They are reading data. They are finding sensitive data. They are exfiltrating that sensitive data. And then they are encrypting what remains. And they hand you a ransom. This is their pattern. So that means in the world of defense, we are playing such a game that is, and I hate using that term game, but it's very painful that we have to think about defensive strategies in under 30 minutes, under 2 hours. Somewhat unrealistic, right? And then you kind of look at, one of the things I mentioned was the engineering, right? The human element of what people build. And by no means did an engineer or engineering at Microsoft intend to release create a vulnerability. But when I was reading this, I was like, Microsoft Partner Center, interesting, because being a solutions architect, I understand I've implemented the world of Dynamics portals. And you know what the Dynamics framework is used for across both for customers and for Microsoft. And I just thought, how is that? I mean, how is the vulnerability at the portal level? Because the portal level actually is not like a unique portal. And when you dig down into some of these vulnerabilities, and this is why you can't just stop at just reading this to see if it's even relevant to you. You actually have to keep digging. And what I found with this is that it wasn't the partner portal, that it was in fact Power Apps, right? There was a release of Power Apps that introduced this particular vulnerability, of which the Microsoft Partner Center utilizes. And then we think about Power Apps and where Power Apps is used. It's used all throughout Dynamics, throughout Microsoft. It's used even in the redevelopment of a lot of these old archaic applications. It's used in SharePoint to make a list look a lot prettier, right? To look like it's almost like an application. So the threats that we face when you look at both criminal activity and even the architecture and even the processes of the company that owns this, and you find that you have critical vulnerabilities that are then exploited, right? And that means that someone took advantage of this and a customer was affected. So let's talk about the tenant and where security teams are going to need some information now, right? So I've experienced an issue, and one of the core things that they look at are logs. And logs are directly, both the duration of a log or the existence of the log are directly tied to licenses, what license type you have. As a good example, I might have an E3 and you have an E3 and an E5. And those logs, when associated to a user, determine how long the data of, like, as a good example, their activity, as well as not necessarily their sign-in, but their activity, is kept, which means if I don't know if I don't have any access to these logs, if I don't know if security is not utilizing or ingesting these logs that you might know of that lives underneath the world of Azure, they only have an incomplete picture, right? Now, we'll continue on in terms of like what we're facing. And if you're not familiar with the Digital Defense Report, sorry, I'm trying to advance my slide here. The Digital Defense Report is released every year in October, typically. Last year in 2025, I think that was the fifth or possibly fifth version of that, fifth year. And what it tells you is generally the challenges, that the trends of what customers had faced in the prior year, right? And from that, like, this original slide came from what I did for 2024. And all I did last year was actually just scratch out the numbers and just put the new ones, because oftentimes many of these threats and trends, they just continue, they grow until the point sometimes where the number just falls off. As a good example of that number falling off, I think in 2023 was the last time you saw a 99% attempt to attack the backup in the Digital Defense Report. And then it disappeared, right? Because 100% is just not a great number. So, we'll talk too more about this concept of encryptions and exfiltration. And even as we're talking about this, I want you to understand that everything we are talking about lives underneath the world of Azure. And so we can't just think of necessarily Azure as only any one side, as any enterprise workloads like VM, right? Azure VMs or SQL or Azure Files, right? Versus, or even Entra or even Microsoft, because it's this holistic attack and holistic, like, overall and overarching impact. So as we really break this down a little bit more, we're going to talk about the impacts of encryptions and exfiltration. That number started at 16% one year, then it went to 23% 2024, and then now it's up, right? They don't even say it's 30%, they just say it's up 7%. So I'm like, oh, up 7%? That's got to be like, now it's 30%. The new trend, the more prevalent trend of exfiltrations, human operated, right, remote encryption. There was an admin, just a regular admin, and he wanted to prove whether or not he could encrypt OneDrives in his organization to do a remote encryption. So he went about it, testing it. And he was able to say, oh, yeah, I absolutely can remote encrypt my OneDrives, these OneDrives on my network. And instead of like reporting this and getting a bounty from Microsoft, he wrote a blog on how to do it. And you're like, this is so painful, right? But it's important to understand that these are the things that are accessible. And if they're accessible to admins without malicious intent, they're accessible to everyone else. And then, of course, the hybrid attack being on the upswing, right? These are both the attack of going back into a physical network and then also into cloud resources. The other number that you'll see on the bottom right-hand corner is this 80%. So last year, the identity, right, successful identity attacks of these, like ransomware, 42% of those attacks were from identity attacks. And that number now has escalated to 80%. But we'll talk really about both the user identity in a minute, as well as the rise of token, right, attacks. So in all of this understanding, we also think about a cyber incident response. And the cyber incident response of there could be 100 of us watching this video right now. And 100 of us will have 100 different plans and 100 different results in terms of how we come out of an attack, simply because the human element, our preparation, or maybe you have some that are really have brought the NIST framework into like the 2.0 framework into your organization, and you are driving um, a different response, right, to all of this. Throughout a cyber incident response, there are generally roles, and whether you are a company that has 5 people on your response team or 2, to a company that might have 20, because right, you now have both GRC, right, your governance, risk, and compliance. You've got legal, you have communications, whatever it may be. Each one of those roles throughout the response, throughout this incident, they require different data. They ask different questions, and they're looking for different answers. And this is why it's also critical to consider a better collaboration, that we cannot just go blindly into and say, I need to back up. And this is beginning to see the separation of what we do when we talk about backup in the world of incident response. For us, what we try to do with our customers is we promote cross collaboration. We try and help them understand the impacts and the value of understanding different requirements throughout the cyber incident response, right? Other than just to back up and be able to restore. Now, it's even kind of worse, I would say worse in the sense of for those companies that have also just said, now we're going to go do AI. We're doing some AI, whether that AI is Copilot or you're building something, on the, that's publicly accessible for your, customer base, or you're building something on top of Copilot for, your internal utilization. But just the nature of what we just did, of our stepping into this space without understanding those implications, those impacts, we have just introduced additional threat vectors right at the first day, right? Without kind of understanding this impact. Now, kind of an example of that is, prior to the rise, of AI in organizations, you have companies are facing like endpoint to cloud vulnerabilities, or cloud back to the physical network, or even cloud to cloud traversing. And in the world of 365 is a good example. The attack vectors were generally coming from the compromise of a credential or an admin account, account synchronization, or even right federated this trust between. And now that we are also utilizing SSO, whether you're using Microsoft's SSO or something like an Okta, the use of SSO now has even exposed data even worse, right? Or SSO back in the day was every network admin's favorite thing, and every help desk team's favorite thing, because it helped to solve the first issue of password reset, and then it helped to solve control of access. But now it's kind of exposed that the fact that I can come in and I can traverse now multiple SaaS or even multiple applications because of SSO, right? This ends up with things like deletions from Siemens, right? Devices, exfiltrations out of ServiceNow, right? Deletions out of even IBM, even the backup, like I mentioned. Whether you are Veeam or Rubrik or anything, we are all controlled generally with customers' access to that. So you have to also consider in all of this. Now here comes AI, right? Your use of AI, and what happened overnight? Not just like what you guys are going to do with this cool stuff, but overnight what you have to deal with now. And if you haven't changed your process, as a good example, the plugins and the functions that are accessible. When you are, there's this concept of like using what is out of the box, right, in Copilot, and then customizing it using Copilot Designer, and you're creating connections. I'm creating connections to a bunch of data sources, and I'm using in there a bunch of plugins if I'm going to customize this. And those plugins, at the other side, are vendors, and you have no idea what their operational processes are. If they are a zero trust organization, how they are protecting their code, because we don't want to end up with another SolarWinds situation, right? You have this sleeper that has entered into your world via third-party plugin. So we cannot just be focused on even backing up and recovering users and data. Now we have to understand, if you are in an AI initiative or initiatives, what are we going to do about everything else? You know, these engineers have now pointed to data sources, and those data sources now are in a tier 1 recovery. I don't know. Right? So much of these things that we face require for you to elevate how you talk and how you deal with vendors. And we'll talk specifically about vendors that deploy any apps, or right, the service principal in Entra, and their access to data. So Druva is a company, and we interact with your data. We utilize the Graph API. We deploy enterprise applications, and that's how we communicate. And so what you need to understand about our platform, when we pull your data out, what is it that we are going to do to state both how we are going to protect that data, how in specifically for like a backup, how can we reassure you that when you need it, your data is there? So you need to understand what mechanisms your vendors, any vendors that are now tapping into your Entra ID, having access to all of your data, whether it's data classification, whether it's backup, whether it's governance, whether it's security, whether it is endpoint management, they're pulling data out. So first question in that is, what is your operational, what's your operational plan? Like, how are you protecting your users in your world? And then in your architecture of where you house our data, what are the mechanisms in case that you did experience, you as the customer experienced a compromise of a credential, and that user traversed through your utilization of SSO and into this third-party vendor? Do you have things like rollback actions so that deletions really aren't deletions? Do you have the ability to lock down users? Do you have the ability to use things like geofencing for admin access so that admins can only access things from within a particular IP range? You need to elevate this checklist of any of these apps. So all you have to do, of any of these vendors that connect directly, that you're aware of. We're not even talking about any of these AI plugins, right? So elevate that. Now we'll step into beginning of really talking about Entra. Druva and many, handful of vendors, we back up Entra. We have an identity backup, right? So we started with Entra. We are now backing up or releasing Active Directory and Okta within like the next month. So the value of backup isn't just the ability to restore. You need other functions that are going to help you, because your identity is the first to, one, validate when you are in an attack, when you are responding, and you have to verify is now different, right? Is now different. From when you started watching this to this point, your Entra ID can be different. And the question for you comes with, how will you know if what is there now is good? If you don't have a prior point of time and the data underlying that data to be able to say, yeah, our users are good. Remember, right, our users are clean. Our groups are good. Our conditional access policies are as expected. Right? So I'll give you a good example here. All right, taking a sip of my coffee. We had a customer, we were backing up 365s, like a large insurance company, and they didn't want to back up their Entra ID, which is fine, right? They felt it was a security risk. Sometimes you have security teams that they make those decisions. But in a quarterly review that I do with some of our enterprise customers, I, prepare, and we actually, Druva has this concept of an active license or a preserved. Active is simply everyone that we're backing up actively, every user. And preserved is the user has left, and we're going to hold the data for however long their retention policy is. And for this customer, I ran this just in preparation of our call, and I noticed this spike of preserved users. It spiked, and then it went down. And I was like, that's very interesting. So I checked our logs, I checked our backend, I asked for engineering to double check, and there was no error that came through, right? Every call that we made appeared to be valid. Every data that we received, every point of information. So I sent this information over to this customer, this rather large insurance company. And I said, are you aware that roughly around this date, something happened? Something happened to your users. And so it took them about a week to come back and say, we found that there was an admin that executed PowerShell, and it was by chance happened to be on a dynamic distribution group. And he affected, right, the properties of this, and then spent the next day quietly cleaning that up. And in that, by all means, there was a couple things that were lost. It was what was lost in that quiet cleanup was the organization's ability to put some guardrails in place, the organization's ability to explain that and to document that. That's a reality. It's an accident. It happened. It's not intentional, right? So backup of your identity layer isn't only for the ability to restore, but it's the ability to have these prior points of time for all of these objects for your security team to also utilize. Here's this JSON for every user, for every application, enterprise application, for every conditional access policy to ensure that do we know what happened, right? Because without that, without your ability to see these patterns and to monitor this and to see historic patterns, right? The simple things like why was a user created on Sunday? We only onboard on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Or maybe to ensure that moving forward you can predict these things that become a little bit more predictable is that you do pick days to onboard, because then you can see things outside of the window faster, right? But you need historic data and historic monitoring. Now let's talk about recovery, right? The process of recovery in all of this. Depending on who you're dealing with, we'll just talk about, in this case, backups, right? Generally, backup vendors utilize the Graph API, and there is no real thing such as bulk recovery, all right? There's bulk orchestration. And the reason why I say that is because to back up your data and to use Microsoft's approved methods as we use the Graph API, which means at any given time we can only read so much, and at any given time we can only write back so much. And in fact, writing back is slower than reading all the data. So understand that bulk recovery is orchestration more than anything, and there's nothing wrong with that orchestration. But you also need to understand too and consider in the recovery that from a resilience perspective, we need to recover small, iterative, validated, clean data. And when we dealt with like just on-prem, backups, customers are familiar with this concept of like a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or whatever you guys call it, right? Maybe it's only 3 tiers, maybe there's 4. But in the world of your data, let's just say for 365 or even Azure VMs, right? Any of your SQL backups, that or Azure files, right? You need to understand, here's this first group that I need to recover, and who is in that? Not only do I need to recover that data, I need to prove and have the assets and prove that what is being recovered is clean, right? You also have to consider things like time-sensitive data. And time-sensitive data is not the same thing as sensitive data. We'll talk about that in a second. And then the next tier, right, begins to kind of like this pyramid, right? A little bit bigger group, decision makers, people that are in operations like IT, people that are in operations for your warehouse distribution, for your production, for your manufacturing, your GRC team. And then the next tier, right? The rest of the corporate functions, your sales team, your call center. The time between all of these doesn't imply that it's like months. What it just implies is that you are in small iterative cycles, because you also can't just say, I need to bulk recover. I need to prove what was in there. So this is also part of like the separation, right? The different classes of data protection companies, the ones that stepped more and further into an understanding cyber resilience. So you have companies like Druva that built anomaly detection. We started with the endpoint like 5 years, 6 years ago. And we took that architecture and our knowledge and how we're going to build this large language model and allow you to use that in whether you're using this anomaly detection as an additional signal for your security, or you are truly just using it to understand what was affected and then to have the evidence to prove that. So a bulk concept cannot just be considering, like if you go back here, if we go back into this slide, if I consider I have a button that says, oh, I'm going to bulk recover. Well, in that, how will you control that the call center doesn't get recovered first? And I'm not saying the call center is not important. What I'm saying is the call center in your recovery of getting back to doing business, in this case, the call center might be a priority 3, right? So you need to utilize, and where backup companies that are really effective at having built this data anomaly, which is different than user behavior. This is a data about data, is that we back up and then we have iterative backups all throughout the history. It could be for a year or 5 years, but then you have the asset. And in the world of 365, you can't just recover into OneDrive. You can't just recover over in SharePoint because of version history, right? All you're doing is leaving that affected file, that altered file in place in version history. So you have to first have an asset that points you to the exact files that were affected and then delete them. Yeah, that guy who ran that PowerShell that altered 1,500 users, you're going to say, you're going to use your power for good. We need you to delete this data. And then from that, then you can recover the 500,000 altered files or the 4 terabyte SharePoint site collection, right? You're going to be able to recover that. You're going to have the assets to prove of those tier 1 users that you have verified and recovered clean. And the recovered clean, now you get into a different scenario with the data that has to go back into your Azure VMs, Azure files, Azure SQL, your SharePoint, your OneDrive, your email. But that point of time is literally no longer the standard. It is fundamentally what backup companies are based on, but you also have to look at time-sensitive data. And time-sensitive data requires something different. So example of time-sensitive data is that you're an engineering or you're a construction company, and you have a team that works on bid packages, and it's like a team of 15, and it took you 3 months to build this bid package, and that bid package is due next Monday, right? And you've been hit, and your security team now says, oh, you can go back 2 weeks. That sounds not bad, right? Or you can go back to last week. But what you haven't done is you haven't, one, proved that over time that data is clean, unless your backup vendor has some mechanism of both creating what is called, like for us, we've created this curated snapshot. And this was something we started once again with the endpoint data protection, uh, right? Built that product, understood the architecture, changed what we needed to change, and then took it beyond into OneDrive, into SharePoint, into your enterprise workloads, and that is to build a snapshot that never existed. And we're going to piece together the last known good clean file based upon scanning through all of these snapshots. So that is a different response than that of just a prior point of time. And I've mentioned the endpoint a couple of times, and I'll be the first to say when I first started working at Druva about 5.5 years ago, I was like, who needs backup endpoints anymore? Everyone's saving stuff on OneDrive or Google Drive or whatever your company provides. But that's not the reality of what we do. One, there are users that do in their day-to-day, they work on sensitive data, whether that sensitive data is a budget, is your board report, is even if they are utilizing the OneDrive sync, that data still resides on the endpoint. And now what we're talking about, what we're looking at is uh, the rise of these AI developers and engineers, and some of these may not actually be engineers, right? They never follow the normal development cycle. They are, let's just say, they've got a license, they're a power user, they have a license for Copilot, now Designer, and they're like, oh, let's go do this. This is really cool. But on their endpoints, on their laptops, and on their desktops are things that now have even more impact to your organization that you may not be prepared for. And this leads us to also the concept of like what we talked about the digital defense report. And in the digital defense report was the rise of going from, I think, 42 to 80% for credential, like compromised credential in these successful attacks. And one of those things was the rise of token, right? Using tokens, authorized tokens that had not expired. So we have to know now that these engineers that are connecting to any SaaS application, right, or however the architecture is in that data connection, they are now accessing data that has likely very sensitive, or they have little test data sets on their endpoints that they're testing with, or on their Azure VMs that they're using to develop. So now we have to look at, and even some of those, like I said, in the nature of what we do, I download a file, and in that file, it's living in my downloads folder. So that storm 0501 has now new targets, additional targets. The first targets that they had were people that were either, if your organization was not using a group policy to force writing to a OneDrive, and people had the choice to use OneDrive, you have sensitive data that resides on these laptops, desktops, Azure VMs, or VMs. And then you also have elevated potential data sets that these engineers are using to build what they're building. So we have to also look at being able to identify, not just and be able to back up and restore what is on the endpoint now, but also identify those pieces of sensitive data. Whether your AI includes pulling from Dynamics, Microsoft 365, SharePoint, or pulling from any one of these other technologies, right, and incorporating that as a knowledge source. The results, basically, you have to consider what result am I going to have? So in the world of recovery and resilience, yes, I can recover my CISO's OneDrive. And in there for Druva, because we are in the class of data protection company that has elevated resilience and provided more resilience features, I can say that these 8,700 files are the last known good clean file for that CISO. And then I can turn around and say, of that, these are the files, these 1,500 files were encrypted. And you have to remember, You go back to what the Digital Defense Report is saying. The Digital Defense Report is saying that the pairing of encryption is also exfiltration. So if we know, we can tell you what 1,500 files, we're going to give this data. We have this data because we have, right, we've built anomaly detection. We know exactly what's been altered, encrypted, deleted. And then you turn around and you can turn around and scan both, your endpoint data, especially your endpoints with what is sensitive. So you go back to that cyber incident response team. Sorry if you guys can hear my dog in the background. And you turn around and you're able to provide to this GRC team not only the validation and the proof that what you recovered was clean, but you can also provide the asset of what was encrypted, what was altered, right? And then you can provide the asset of, hey, instead of trying to figure out what was in the 8700, here's 159 files that were on that CISO's laptop and or OneDrive that were sensitive. So resilience isn't just about, being able to recover. It is by all means part of recovery, right? But every point of time until that incident has been closed requires data, requires an asset that allows you to prove or disprove something has been affected and then something has returned back to a state of good, right? That's also everything underneath this world of Azure. As you may have started with Entra ID, you may have then expanded and moved your users' files from a file server into OneDrive, and then you continue to build on top of that with Teams and using SharePoint, right, and organizational team-based data. And then you decided you're going to go into and start using and transitioning and moving into Azure VMs. You're going to transition to using Azure files for certain ones, Azure Blob Storage, whatever it is. All of these assets that you use, all of this data that you require, that you are using, requires resilience architecture, a resilience plan, not just a backup vendor, right? We have to kind of look beyond this, the concept of just, yes, yeah, I can back up, we can back up Teams chat, like channel chat, and we can back up individual chat. Yes, we have retention policies that you can keep data forever or keep it only for the last 30 days, whatever that is. Yes, we can back up shared mailboxes. Yes, we can back up user mailboxes that converted to a shared mailbox, right? Those are backup features and functionality. What you require now is a different plan for getting Azure and everything underneath Azure back to a state with proof, the state of good, right? The state of clean, so that you are back up and running. So, and that is it, right? That's our session for today. I think I'm a little short on time, but I think there's a lot to unpack in this session. And we all have, right, different places that we are. And for many, it could be budgetary things that we may not have the right license for, may not even understand that we need data protection as an example for 365 and that investment. But we have to really understand what the threats are to Azure and everything underneath that world of Azure that we're using in order to turn around and know what we need to put in place to plan and to be resilient in the face of a ransomware or just a cyber attack, and then to present this message back to our leadership and to say, this is what we know. I mean, ultimately, if you provide that and provide that this is what we know, and those decisions continue to be, right, whether you are able to get better licensing in your 365 and whether or not you have license for elevated features in Purview, which by all means, if you have license for Purview, and if you don't have the resources, you should become a Purview admin. This is an opportunity for you to understand how to ensure that you have retention policies, how to ensure that you are utilizing and deploying sensitive data labels and what that means for your organization. So use both what you have with Purview as well, with your licenses. Know what logs you have. Collaborate with your across departments to understand and ask this question: what is our plan to recovering from an attack against Azure, or even Azure VMs, or Entra, or Microsoft 365, or even our laptops? Know what that plan is. Know what your role is supposed to be. Provide the knowledge back to different departments about what you know, and do not be stuck, uh, at the point of being in the midst of an attack before you're trying to find this information. All right, well, thank you, and I hope you have a great day and enjoy the rest of the sessions here at Azure Spring Clean 2026. Bye-bye.